Property values can't keep rising. It's all a Ponzi scheme and it's going to come crashing down around us. The only reason property markets have survived is because of bank and government support. Well, that's the sort of commentary you're going to find in the media and over the internet at present. On the other hand, you're also going to find many experienced property commentators suggesting we're at the beginning of a new property cycle, one where property values will rise considerably. So who's right? Can property values really keep rising? And can they rise as much as they have over the last 3 or 4 decades? Well, that's the question Stuart Wemyss and I are going to discuss today as we explain the various factors that created the significant property price growth that many of us enjoyed over the last couple of decades. However, moving forward, many of these growth drivers won't be the same. So what's ahead for property values? That's what we're going to discuss. So welcome to today's show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
As we're into the beginning of a new property cycle, some people are asking, can property prices continue to rise at the same rate at which they've done for the last 3 or 4 decades? In fact, some people are asking, can property values keep going up considering how expensive they are today? Now, I know that's a question that's been asked of Stuart Wemyss, an independent financial advisor and author, because he's written a great blog outlining his thoughts. So I look forward to having my chat with him today and giving you my ideas as well. So welcome, Stuart.
Hey, Michael, great to be with you again. Thanks for the invitation.
Now, before I ask you the question about what do you think is going to happen to our property values over the next decade or two, it's probably instructive to look back and see what happened to property values in the past. Now, in the blog I just mentioned, and I'm going to leave a link to it in the show notes, you had a graphic showing what happened to house prices over the last 5 decades from 1970 to 2020. Now, I know I bought my first investment property in the early 1970s. I paid $18,000, and Stuart, I got $12 a week rent, and I was excited. By the way, I took a 30-year loan, couldn't afford it. I went halves with my parents. But back then, $18,000 was a lot of money. The family car, Stuart, was the Holden Kingswood. Remember those?
Yes. Yeah. My parents had a Kingswood.
It cost $2,000. So I guess one of the first things you've got to do when looking back at house prices, or at least seeing how they're performing, is to see how they performed with inflation. So an important measure is really real price growth. So what's driven price growth over the last 3-4 decades?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting conversation, Michael, and I think property has always been expensive, no matter when you bought it. You said in the 70s, that was your first property. It seemed like a lot of money, and it was a lot of money at the time. And we might go out and buy a property for $1 million today, and, you know, it'll be flagrant. $1 million is a substantial amount of money. It's expensive. I don't think that's changed, and I think that's just our own sort of human behaviour that they always say that you tend to overestimate what you can achieve personally in the short run, but underestimate what we achieve in the long run, which is true, right? When we set goals, we don't, we tend to overpitch them over a 12-month, but the long-term goals, we undercook them. And I think it's got something to do with just human perspective, our overall perspective in things. It's like when you look at a sunset and you go, wow, that's beautiful. I'll take a photo of it. And you take a photo of it and you look at the photo and the actual sunset is minuscule compared to how you see it. And again, that's just our mind playing tricks on us. So I think we've got to understand that our mind does play tricks on us. And when we look at property values and property growth and how things seem expensive today, I think we've got to sort of step back. And that's what I wanted to do, is step back and have a look at a longer term view to really understand how sort of property price movements have occurred. I mean, we all get asked, you and I always get asked, and anyone in property gets asked, can growth continue? If you look at average growth, just median house price growth, in capital cities across Australia, it's somewhere between 7 and 8% over the last 40 years. That's a significant price increase. And when you talk to people in the US, other financial planners in the US, and you talk about sort of capital growth rates and what assumptions you might make for financial modelling when completing financial plans, they can't believe some of the assumptions or the historic sort of growth rates that property has been achieving in Australia. And mathematically, like if we look at a macroeconomic level and think every property in Australia will rise by 8% per annum over the next 40 years, mathematically that just cannot happen. Unless incomes rise by the same or similar amounts, it just can't happen. And that's almost certainly not going to happen. So I think the answer is no, property prices can't keep growing at the same level. And then I think what we need to do is, as you said, it's instructive then look back and what has then occurred over the last 40 years that have contributed to this price appreciation. And then it allows us to form a view about whether those factors will persist over the next 40 years, or will there be other factors that will sort of play out. And so when you sort of think back what's happened over the last 40 years, I mean, there's been a few things that obviously we can talk about: population growth, a single income family going to a double income family, where both spouses are working in some capacity, where in the 80s and 70s, typically it was one spouse working.
Well, let's go into those one by one, Stuart. But first of all, I think I agree with you that not all properties can increase in value moving forward. So that's a bit of a spoiler alert, but some are going to, and some are going to perform better than others. But when I first started investing, I was really thrilled when my interest rate, my home loan rate, was less than 10%. So inflation was 10, 12%. That's one of the things that made my property values grow. But it's real growth that's important. So the aim of investing in property, of course, is to build an asset base to give you future cash flow and future retirement income. So all this has to be done in the context of what the cost of bread and milk and holidays and other things are going to be in the future as well. So if we've got a lower interest rate environment, a lower wages growth environment, a lower inflationary environment, you don't need 10% capital growth to be ahead, do you?
No, that's right. And the chart that you referenced that I embedded in the blog, which, as you said, the link's in the show notes, it looked at real price growth between the capital cities as well, so excluding inflation, which I think is really important because inflation has a big impact if you look over a 40-year period. But we need to ignore the impact of inflation because, as you said, spending power is important. So if you're happy, then Michael,
that Kingswood that cost $2,000 then would be the equivalent of actually people don't buy sedans anymore, do they? It'd be a Ford Ranger or a Toyota Hilux seems to be the family car today in many ways, but that's a $40,000-$50,000 expense, isn't it? So yes, we're talking about real price growth. But we also got to remember that property is a game of finance, and finance was difficult. So one of the big changes over the 40 years was not just the cost of finance, but the availability of finance. Because when I first started borrowing, I had to put a suit and tie on. I had to go and sit with the bank manager. They were careful when I was first married. They didn't take my wife's income into account. So money has become easier and looser. And that sort of changed with deregulation, didn't it?
So I think that's the biggest. It's impossible, I think, to pull apart and try and quantify what some of these factors have contributed. But just anecdotally, I think this is the biggest contributor to property price growth over the last 40 years, and by a substantial margin. So I don't know what that might be, but maybe it's 30 or 40% of the contribution to price growth. And that's right. If you look back, 70s, 80s, we had a very regulated banking market, a lot of sort of state-owned institutions, banking institutions. There wasn't the internet, so you couldn't Google, how to borrow, how much can I borrow, who offers the best interest rate, how do I maximize my borrowing capacity, those sorts of things that you can very easily do today. And you're right, you had to sort of go to the bank and beg and almost, present your case, argue your case about why you should be a borrower. Whereas the biggest turning point was early 90s when, which was just after, deregulation, banking deregulation happened in the late 80s, and Aussie home loans entered the market early 90s. when interest rate margins were about 4% and they're about 2% today. So that's the margin, the gross profit that a bank makes from lending, or they need to pay for all the expenses out of that. But so the margins halved over that over the 90s decade, thanks to competition. But competition created a couple of things. Obviously, education, it educated borrowers about what was doable, that if your bank said no, we'll walk next door because the bank next door might say yes, for example. It put downward pressure on margins, so it just made it more competitive and more cost effective. And that's continued to be the case. And then it's created opportunities for lenders to offer borrowings to people that wouldn't otherwise qualify with the big four banks, which is not to say that they were a bad credit risk, just that they didn't fit inside the square. I mean, that's changed a little bit now. The big four banks have sort of, over the last couple of decades, kind of come to the party with that regard. But back in the 90s, they were very conservative, whereas Aussie Home Loans, a mortgage manager at which they were at that time, could be have a little bit more flexibility in terms of borrowing capacity. So borrowing capacity, if you look at it back in the 80s and 70s compared to what it is today, banks will be prepared to lend people somewhere between 2 and 3 times more today based on their income and financial position than what they did back in the 70s and 80s. Now, obviously, that didn't happen overnight. That's gradually crept up and probably peaked just before the GFC, 07, 08. And since then, it's either flatlined or come down, and we've both talked a lot about constraints on borrowing capacity and those sorts of things. So I think that's, if you go and take a market and then say, look, everyone, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 times more money than what I used to give you, that's going to create a lot of price growth, because that's a lot of money coming into a market. So of course, that's going to create some appreciation. So I think that's the big one.
The other one, of course, with regard to availability of finance, is the cost of money. So people forget that around the global financial crisis time, interest rates were totally different to what they are today. So you were paying often 7-8% for your mortgage. So that to borrow on $1 million property or a $500,000 property, then today you'd be paying the same amount of interest and being able to get $1 million property. So the availability of finance is one thing that has led to property price growth and the cost of finance. I think the other thing that you started to mention a moment ago was population growth. There are more of us, but we were also wealthier. We were earning more, Stuart.
Yeah, that's right. Population growth has a couple of different components. And I think from a macroeconomic level, so from a total property level, we often think about population growth in terms of housing demand. There's more people, so we need more houses. Sometimes we can't build them fast enough, so it creates a sort of supply shortage, which results in increasing prices, the old sort of supply-demand equation. But I don't think that's really true with investment-grade property. I think the bigger impact that the population growth has with investment-grade property is overall economic activity. So if our population is growing, then so is our GDP, so is consumer demand. If we're taking on skilled migrants, they're typically, white-collar professionals, higher income earners that will be attracted to the capital cities that have the job opportunities. That's a generalisation, because only about a third of overseas immigration is skilled migrants. So it's not a large capacity. But if you think about students, which make up another third, again, they're contributing towards rental demand, but also, again, overall economic activity. And it's that economic activity that I think stimulates the economies within capital cities like Melbourne and Sydney, that creates overall demand and just increases everyone's income. Not everyone's income, but the people that are servicing those industries and so forth. And that's what I think indirectly creates property price growth for investment grade property.
One of the other factors that increases median price growth, but doesn't necessarily affect the growth of the value of a particular property, is the sort of properties we're living in today, Stuart. So they're very different. They're bigger than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. So that's one of the reasons. The fact that we're building amongst the biggest houses in the world is one of the reasons house prices are expensive. And more of us are just expecting that. People are moving out of home expecting to live in the same sort of property that it took their parents 30, 40 years to build up the enough equity to own.
The first property I bought was a 2-bedroom 1950s, 1960s house in Moorabbin that was on a large block. I think it was about 800 square metres. It was a pretty large block, but the house was smack bang in the middle of the block. So you had this really large front yard and a really large backyard. And it was a small home. It was, it was in a disrepair, to renovate it. Anyway, if you drive through, I can't believe when I drive through sort of a new build area or even drive past a new build area, how unbelievably large the houses are. They build almost to the exact perimeter. And in some developments, you speak to electricians and so forth, they say, well, we can just walk across the roofs of the houses. They're built so close together. And the finishes, the size, everything is better, bigger, different. So we've got to think about then how much of that impact has that had on overall property price growth? Because you can have obviously land appreciation, but then you can have building improvements, and those building improvements will start to manipulate that median growth rate. So that's certainly something that's going to that has occurred substantially over the last few decades.
So we've spent the last 10 minutes or so reminiscing about the past and how things have changed. But let's get back to the question I first asked. And people are wondering, can this continue? So which of those factors are likely to continue moving forward? And the first one people are going to ask is population growth, because clearly we aren't having the population growth currently because our borders are shut. But in my mind, once the borders do open, whenever that will be, we're going to have population growth continuing for a couple of reasons. First of all, the government recognises it's important for our economy, not just for the universities, but skilled migration is important to get rid of that missing middle of trades that we're actually getting a bit of a skewing of our population at the moment, with a lot of higher educated people and not as much a middle class in Australia. But one way of increasing productivity, of course, is having more of us do things. So another way of increasing the GDP, because we're not going to get that much more productive, so maybe I used the wrong word, but one way of increasing GDP is just having more of us here.
I think you're bang on, Michael. I think putting aside the terrible, economic and particularly health impacts of COVID, putting that aside for a second, COVID will be probably the biggest contributor towards immigration demand, I think, for Australia over the next couple of decades. I think if most people sit down and think, well, if I'm going to immigrate somewhere, it's going to be, Australia, Canada, or maybe the UK. And out of all those, Australia certainly stands out from a health management perspective, and I think will be at the top of many people's lists. So I think then it's just it falls back to government policy. I think the demand will certainly be there. Then it's just up to us who we want to allow into the country and how many of those people.
Apart from the people, I think companies are going to want to situate themselves here too. So if they're going to want to have a new base in the growing Southeast Asian area, where are they going to put their Southeast Asian corporate office? And you can now see that Melbourne, Sydney, and to a lesser extent Brisbane are going to be high on the list because of all the factors that we understand: a stable government, a good health system, the ability to control the virus, and a strong economy.
Yep, spot on. Now, the thing is, though, Michael, if I'm a property developer, like a big residential property developer, then I look at and I think about population growth, and I think that's going to be higher or the same than it was the last few decades. I would get excited by that. But if I'm a retail property investor, you and me that want to go and invest in residential property, will the demand for property in these outer areas, these new build areas, because we need to build more houses because our population is growing, does that really make any difference to the value of a property in Hawthorn or Bondi or so forth, or Indooroopilly in Brisbane? I struggle to see where the connection will be, but the most important thing is overall economic activity. We want to invest in an area or location where there's an over demand of people that want to buy property or own property in that location that have increasing incomes. We're not just talking about average incomes, we're talking about increasing. So they've got the capacity to always pay more. Well, the only way you're going to generate a substantial pool of those people is if you have strong economic growth. So I think that when we talk about population growth and it being really good, that's where it's going to impact those investment grade locations.
Scary how much we think alike, because I agree with you. So we're saying much the same thing, that just because this population growth doesn't mean the value of certain properties are going to go up, because most of those new people are going to move to the outer suburbs or to the high-rise buildings, which we know are not investment grade apartments. So we want to invest in areas where there's established money rather than the new money, areas where there's not lots of new people who've suddenly taken on a mortgage in a 90% loan to value ratio, and if they lose their jobs or have a baby, they're going to have some financial difficulties. So the sort of properties that are going to outperform, and I think this is where we're heading with our conversation, is some areas are going to do well over the next 2, 3, 4 decades and others aren't. And I see them in being in areas where established money areas, and this is not a judge of people, but if in the suburb there are people who've owned their homes for 30, 40 years, like some of those suburbs you mentioned a moment ago, and so they've got very little mortgage, and there's other people who've owned their home for 20 years and they've got half their mortgage paid off, and sure, there's still going to be some people who moved in over the last couple of years and they've got a bit of depth, but there's a depth to owner occupiers and they've got the income. So these are often gentrifying areas, a rising income so they can afford to pay more. But Stuart, what a lot of people forget is you also want your tenants to have be in the right demographic, that they've got rising income as well. Because in the future, your rental income, what you're going to live off, is going to be dependent upon your tenants having the ability to pay more rent in the future, which is not as likely to happen in those new home areas.
Yeah, spot on. And so population growth is important, but for different reasons, I think, with respect to investment grade property.
Okay, so as we're talking about what factors are going to play out in the future compared to what happened over the last 3 or 4 decades, borrowing capacity, I can't see how that's going to increase in general, other than if people are getting higher wages. Interest rates can't get cheaper. The banks are not going to give us more than 80-85% loan to value ratio. They've learned their lessons. They've seen what's gone on overseas. So that's going to, in some ways, be a negative impact in general.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to have any contribution or any material contribution to property price growth over the next few decades. I agree. I would say almost with absolute certainty that borrowing capacity is not really going to increase. Now, they're going to make some changes to, there's been no release. APRA hasn't told us anything yet, nor has the banks. But last year they announced some relaxation of responsible lending rules. And to my mind, that's more about just trying to apply some more common sense and to treat different people differently rather than have a one-size-fits-all approach. So that'll come into play hopefully this year, and that'll have an impact. But apart from that, I can't see borrowing capacity changing, certainly not even close anywhere near to what happened over the last 2 or 3 decades. And interest rates, I mean, they can't get lower, so they can only rise from here. So in terms of money supply, so money flowing into the property market, it's not going to have the same, if you drew a chart over the last 40 years in terms of the increase of money supply into the property market, that chart over the next 30 or 40 years, I think will be a much flatter trajectory than what it has historically been.
So incomes can't grow as much moving forward, partly because we've got a lower inflationary environment, but Australia isn't going to increase its productivity as much. So you either have to produce more, be more effective, more efficient. So that's going to be another constraint on borrowing capacity, the cost of money, the availability of money, and then your serviceability.
Which is exactly why you want to take that into account with asset selection. You want an asset that is going to appeal to someone that will have, or a group of people, I should say, that will have their income rising at a much faster rate than just the general population. Income appreciation or inflation being so incredibly low is not just happening in Australia, it's a global phenomenon. So, and also, there's no one out there that says that it's going to, or suggesting it's going to change anytime soon. That's a macroeconomic observation. But really what we want to do is invest in a location where, You've got young hedge fund managers, you've got young lawyers that are working, people in business, small business and so forth. These sorts of people that are going to be attracted to that location, they're your target market. So that you want to buy an asset in a location, a type of asset that's going to appeal to those people, because that group of people is always going to have more and more money to spend in those locations, and that's where that growth is going to come from.
Now, some people are going to get offended by what I'm about to say, but the fact is the rich are getting richer. Even during COVID, the gap was wider. And this isn't the time for a social argument, because I'm actually concerned about that too, because if the gap gets too wide, we can see what that's done overseas, overseas recently, and in the past, historically, when the gap between the average person in the street and the 1%, as they call it, widens. But the bottom line is that is happening. So therefore, there are still people who can afford to send their kids to private school, who are able to pay for properties in those areas. And so they're the sort of locations one has to look at. So demographics is going to be very important moving forward. But also where those people who can afford to choose where they want to live are going to want to live is going to change as well. So people don't wake up in the morning wanting to live in some of those outer suburbs, but they live there because that's where they can afford. But I think desirable, aspirational locations are going to come to the fore, especially in the near future, as people realise the importance of neighbourhood after having been locked down a bit with COVID. And many people won't be able to afford it, but there will be a group of people who will be prepared to pay a premium to be within 20 minutes of a number of supermarkets, gyms, parks, beach, lakes. The CBD is probably not going to attract as many people moving forward, Stuart.
And you make a really good point. I mean, you think about the work from home movement. That's great because we get to spend more time with family and our kids if we've got them and those sorts of things. But if you're out in the middle of nowhere and there's nothing to do and nowhere to go, it's fine. You can be at home, but you want to have that diversity. Whereas if you're living in a blue chip suburb, there's a lot of entertainment facilities, shopping, health, all those sorts of amenity that surrounds that's going to really add to your lifestyle. And if you've got more time because you're not commuting as much, you're working from home, well, you're going to avail yourself of those amenities, or at least you can do. So I think that's right. I think the things that have driven the demand for those locations over the last 3 or 4 decades aren't unique. And the same way we all work in capital cities, or not all of us, but population-wise, a large proportion of us, we congregate in capital cities. That's occurred, for thousands of years that we congregate together in a certain that's not going to change just because of Zoom. So these sorts of things will persist. The reason that a Hawthorne has outperformed a Frankston, for example, the fundamental reasons will persist, I think, for the next few decades.
I think the other factor we have to take into account is the rising tide moving forward is not going to lift all ships. So anyone who bought a property in 1980, as we said a while ago, or 1970, has done well. It's doubled in value and doubled in value again. But you looked at all the charts. I know you produce a lot of them. And some properties have increased just a little bit more than average. And while it doesn't seem a lot year on year, when you compound it, having that investment grade property, having a little bit more growth, gives you so much more at the end. It's tax-free growth. You get extra rental as well. So moving forward, that gap between those areas that are going to be in high demand and people can afford to pay more and the average area, I can see only widening. And that's the importance of correct selection of location and then the right asset in that location.
So bang on. That was my conclusion, Michael, that, it has been a rising tide and all ships rise. And if you look at the median growth rate, you could potentially say, look, Stuart, I could have bought a property anywhere and I would have done well. And you'd almost be correct making that assertion. But my conclusion is that for the reasons that we just spoke about, it has been a rising tide. I don't think there could be an X factor in there, that's something that we don't know about that will create or will continue to stimulate that rising tide that wasn't present last few decades but will be present in the future. So that's quite possible too. But if I'm building an investment strategy, I'm going to build it on the assumption that rising tide over the last 30 to 40 years won't or at least the factors that generate it, won't persist, won't continue, except for population growth, as we've talked about. So that's got to be our starting assumption. Not all property will rise at the same rate like it has or similar to how it has in the past. And therefore, I must pick a property that's better than average. I must invest in the highest quality property my budget will allow. And if I do that, then I'm going to outperform the market. Now, if I'm wrong and all ships rise, that's okay. We'll still outperform the market, but the market's doing better. And if I'm right, well, at least I'm going to invest and in a way that's going to earn me maybe an extra 1 or 2% per annum. And as you say, over a 20-year period, that's an extra $1 million of equity. That is substantial.
So how do you outperform the market? Well, we discussed that in the last 2 podcasts that we just released a couple of weeks ago, where we broke down your 8 rules of investing from your book, Investopoly. So if you're listening to this and now see that it's important to understand how to choose an investment-grade property, just go back to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. A couple of weeks ago, Stuart and I went through his 8 rules of investing, which have stood the test of time, but they're also in your book, Investopoly. So where do people get that, Stuart?
They just Google Investopoly or come to prosolution.com.au. We sell it off our website. It's available in, as I say, all good bookstores.
And as well as that, you've got a podcast called Investopoly, which is something that I enjoy listening to. And it's just you talking. And we discuss some of the things when we get together a couple of times a month here as well. But if people enjoy listening to you, learning or by listening rather than reading, they can always read your blog at Pro Solutions as well and on Property Update, but go to Investopoly or look for the Investopoly podcast. Stuart, look forward to catching up with you again real soon.
Thanks for having me again, Michael.
In a moment, I'm going to share with you my regular mindset message. But before I do, I'd like to just follow on with the discussion I had with Stuart, where I think it's clear that not all properties are going to increase in value as strongly as they have in the past. In fact, some won't increase in value much at all once the current impetus of this cycle works its way through. In other words, if there isn't strong wages growth, there isn't the ability to borrow more, some areas are going to suffer. What that means is a rising tide won't lift all ships, and if you're looking to develop financial independence through a property, having a strategic plan, one that's going to prevent you from making emotional decisions, and correct asset selection is going to be critical moving forward. On the other hand, if you're in the right financial position, now is the right time to take action to set yourself up for the opportunities that are presenting themselves as our market moves forward. So if you're wondering what's ahead for property, which are the right properties to look at, if you're looking for direction, guidance and results, my team at Metropole would love to help you. Why not go to metropole.com.au, find out a bit more about what we do? Because in times like this, you need an advisor who's going to take a holistic approach. You can't just use a buyer's agent. You can't even just have a property strategist on your side. You need a holistic advisor who's going to take into account property tax, finance, the research, and understanding some of the principles that we discussed in today's show. So if you're looking at buying your next home or an investment property, whether you're a beginning investor or experienced investor, why not go to metropole.com.au, find out a bit about what my team does, leave us your details, and I'd love to be part of your wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to share with you Warren Buffett's 3-step strategy for success. Now, it's a story I recently read. Is it true or not? I'm not sure, but there's a great message there. And the story went a bit like this. One day, Warren Buffett was sitting in the cockpit of his plane with his pilot, Mike Flint. And they were having a conversation. And Flint turned to Warren Buffett and said, "What does it take to succeed, Warren?" And Buffett shared with him the following 3-step strategy for success. He said, number 1, make a list of your top 25 goals. And then he said, number 2, circle your top 5 goals. And then Warren Buffett went on to say, The third step is eliminating his secondary goals. He got Mike Flint then to write down his top 25 goals, circle the top 5 goals, and then he asked him to transfer his top 5 goals onto a separate piece of paper, and he asked Flint to transfer those 20 secondary goals onto a secondary piece of paper. And he said then, avoid those 20 secondary goals at all costs. That was what Warren Buffett's advice was. And he explained the purpose of this exercise was to help his pilot decide on the goals he wanted to focus on and to ignore all others. Warren Buffett said the key to success is to focus on what's important to you. Now, that makes sense, doesn't it? But I see so many people with a whole list of tasks, and of course, if everything's important, nothing's really, really important. So Warren Buffett's 3-step strategy for success not only helps you to find those things which will have the most impact on your life, but it also helps you to find those things you should ignore. Those 20 secondary goals represent distractions, according to Buffett. Things that are not good for you to use your time for, and things that are going to distract you from pursuing your most important goals. So why don't you follow this exercise as well? Step 1, make a list of your top 25 goals. Step 2, circle the top 5 goals. Step 3, put them on a separate piece of paper, and they're the goals you should pursue. Hope that's given you some hints on how to become more successful in life, but I can't take credit for it. That's Warren Buffett's credit. He deserves it. Well, I hope you now understand a bit more about why some properties are going to outperform others in the future and where to look for them. And if you got some benefit from this, I'd really like you to do me a favour and tell somebody else about the Michael Yardney podcast, because my mission is to make as many people as financially fluent as possible, to raise the standard of financial education, to help more of us enjoy this fantastic world we live in and the new property cycle. So you use the podcast share app on any podcast app, or just tell people about it, or leave a review where you're listening to this podcast. Now, you can catch more of me in between the twice weekly podcasts. I hope you're subscribing to this. If you're not, why not subscribe right now so you keep getting future episodes of the podcast? But you can subscribe to my daily briefing at propertyupdate.com.au, or why not join the private Facebook group? Just look for the Property Update private Facebook group, where every day I'll give a little snippet, exclusive information. Not lots of information, just some charts and some words that will give you some different insights into what's happening in the world of money, finance, property and success. Of course, you can just find me on social media. Just look for Michael Yardney. Catch up with you again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?